Catherine Macaulay never intended to become a nun. Instead, she gathered some companions who were also committed to the needs of the local people in Dublin. When she finally did establish the Sisters of Mercy, right from the very beginning, they took an additional fourth vow to care for the poor, the sick, and the uneducated. When the sisters gathered for their Institute chapter in 2011, they took a hard look at the world around them and asked, what are the pressing needs? What are the issues in society that are hurting us? And this is what they said. We are scandalized by the increase in the impoverishment of peoples, the pervasive denial of basic human rights, the degradation of earth, and increased violence and racism in all its forms. We mourn the continued oppression of women in church and society, unjust immigration laws, and the lack of solidarity among peoples and nations. Ever since then, the Sisters of Mercy have asked their sponsored institutions to also be attentive to these issues, to these critical concerns.
This project was very significant to me as a nursing faculty, that we educate our SXU graduates to be compassionate and to serve wisely and impact themselves, their profession, their families, their community, and the whole world.
The critical concerns of the Sisters of Mercy are exactly what they say. They are concerns that should be critical to every person that comes across them. When you see this list of issues that humanity is still dealing with, you can't not recognize that they are of concern.
One thing I really like about the Sisters of Mercy and the history of the Sisters of Mercy is that they weren't your typical nuns. I teach a lot about nuns in colonial Latin American history. They were nuns who were out in the world. So for me, the critical concerns of the Sisters of Mercy are built on that experience of being out in the world, helping the world, interacting with the world.
These critical concerns, for me, are ethical concerns. And I think all of us through our disciplines touch upon all of them. And I'm happy that Saint Xavier have put these critical concerns at the forefront and allowed us to use those critical concerns as a way to teach and approach and connect with our students.
We have faculty members here who are passionate about immigration, who are passionate about empowering women, stopping racism, stopping violence, protecting and preserving the earth that we are living in. And that's how I see so much significance of the critical concerns that the Sisters of Mercy have framed, and us as human beings and our life and journey on this world.
Nonviolence is one of the Sisters of Mercy critical concerns because violence impacts us in such profound ways. Whether it is an individual impact, the person being a victim of violence, or a collective impact, the community being victimized, or an intergenerational impact.
I think in the U.S., there's the saying that sex sells. I think it should be violence sells. In the U.S., we are a very violent culture. It's in the commercials, it's in the entertainment, and my concern from kind of a marketer and basically a researcher is the desensitization, right? Is just the overall gluttony that we see on a daily basis.
In my teaching aspect here at Saint Xavier, I teach a nursing course related to screening for abuse, and I provide those resources for our students on how to ask such difficult questions related to abuse, how to then provide resources to our victims, and for our nursing students to really understand that this is a huge social concern.
I think that when you talk about violence in history, you have to be upfront about it and you have to share the gory details. And I think I really want students to understand, how you can talk about big numbers of people dying or dictatorships from this political level, but if you don't really understand how that's affecting people's everyday lives, it doesn't hit them in the same way. I try to help people understand that even sometimes violence isn't intentional, but it's just part of the system. It can be socioeconomic harm, it can be environmental harm.
So I appreciate having the critical concerns as kind of our foundational structure. So if I'm teaching in one of my courses about nonviolence, and then the student goes to another discipline and that instructor is teaching in their course about nonviolence, then the student begins to see the importance of nonviolence and addressing violence anywhere and everywhere.
One of the Mercy critical concerns is racism, and that particular critical concern is focused on pointing out racism and ending racism in the world and taking anti-racist actions.
I usually focus heavily on these concerns in my law enforcement and society class. This class is a class that deals with multi-dimensional cultures and law enforcement. How does each interaction between law enforcement officers and community members, how does that not only shape that one incident, but then other incidents to come?
What I really do as a historian is I teach students how race came to be. And I think that's really important because if you don't understand how a concept is constructed in the world, it's much, much harder for you to deconstruct that context.
We could talk about so many things that people have done in the name of science to basically promote agendas which are, for the most part, very nefarious. I think one thing that comes to mind, of course, is eugenics. The concept of intelligence itself. What was that, right? Was that based on what people thought was like some type of cultural prejudice? It's very hard sometimes to realize we might have these blinders on. And that's a key part in trying to make sure that when you, as a responsibility of a science instructor, to make sure you don't get caught up in that.
The idea that people are on some hierarchical level and some have power and some don't, this idea is interwoven in our culture. It's interwoven in our geographic culture as well as the world culture.
Race in the United States is a really hard thing to talk about in class. It really is. And I would say that a lot of students are scared to talk about it. And sometimes looking at race in a historical perspective allows students to talk about race in a way that's not so confrontational.
When we talk about diversity and aspects of racism in science and the practice of it, I think a very important part of what actually is important for the scientific method is bringing in different experiences.
When we talk about women, oftentimes, I think back probably when the Sisters of Mercy came to this country, women were in a role where women were subservient. Women were in a role where they took a back seat to things. And we know that, when Catherine McCauley came to the States, one of her biggest things that she wanted to do was help those who were less fortunate. And that fell into that category of women. And I think that, is a huge concern that we still have.
Women are a little over half of the population, right? And anything that impacts women impacts the family, impacts the community, impacts our earth. which would bring us to other critical concerns.
Coming from the Middle East and what I have learned by reading about the critical concerns of Sisters of Mercy from the perspective of women is that we need to empower ourselves, and also we need to empower our other women to pursue education, to have a better life.
I know in the healthcare industry, the majority of our nurses are women and hold very important roles now in healthcare settings. But still, I think we have a ways to go. So I think in terms of the critical concerns of women, it's one that is very important and one that we continue to work towards.
Bud Light came out with a campaign. You know, they were trying to get people like to have fun and do different things. And one of the things it said on the bottle was, when no isn't in your vocabulary. And people are like, you're gonna put that on a bottle that you're gonna sell to men and serve in bars. And so it was like, people are like, you know how this can be construed maybe in a different manner. And, you know, Bud Light had to apologize. And I actually was talking to my students about this, and you know, I was saying they didn't mean to. It wasn't like the bunch of guys got around and Bud Light were like, let's promote rape, you know, or rape myths or things like that. You know, and one of the students, she spoke up, she had a very good point. She's like, but they still did it. And so maybe by having people who understand that, by having more women in those boardrooms, it's a better way for them to make marketing better, to make us more responsive to concerns.
If we are speaking to victimization of women and a student has experience, we will flesh those experiences out. So generally, my format for not only addressing the critical concerns and not only addressing the subject matter is to use practical experience, whether it's my experience or the student's experience.
The Sisters of Mercy, when they talk about women, they talk about equality. So the decisions we take in our lives, in our education, to make us better in relation to our own life and productivity and our goal and mission in what we want to accomplish in our career. Why immigration is personal for me. I immigrated to the U.S. in 1996. And I wanted a community when I moved to Chicago. So finding this community where predominantly we were immigrants and shared the same faith has done so much goodness to me and to my children as well.
Anthropology has the unique lens of introducing and talking and discussing humans. So if I take immigration, I discuss immigration in the US, but also immigration from around the world. Why do people immigrate? How is immigration dealt with in other places? What do immigrants do when they come here? How do they build their own community and society?
Art gives us a unique opportunity to approach the critical concerns by giving voice to artists to express how they're feeling when they're encountering any of these sort of experiences. It gives us an opportunity for an audience to experience these artworks and then have a greater empathy. You really are trying to help students find those, you know, things that exist in their roots and their traditions, and not shy away from them because they aren't American enough, right? But instead embrace them because they aren't.
The violence at the border or the unaccompanied minors issue at the border, that is something that definitely my students always want to talk about. I had one student last semester, and so she did her senior project on the history of Guatemala and the child migrant situation at the border. And in one discussion post, she wrote something like, I never knew all of these things that had happened, and it makes me feel so bad that I didn't know that this is what my country had been through. And one of the really great kind of interactions that happened with that is another student in the class said, it's okay, you don't need to be mad at yourself because you didn't know these things. You know these things now, and you can tell other people.
As the School of Nursing, we need to make sure that our students who are graduating from our programs understand the needs of the vulnerable population, understand the health and health literacy of immigrants who come to this country. So it is important for me as a faculty on professional level as well as personal level to explore those critical concerns with the faculty who are invested in this as I am, and they use their own experiences and their own education and expertise in bringing the critical concerns to our classrooms.
We had a job fair, and one of the businesses or recruiting people at the job fair was ICE, and students were really upset and they were scared. So, I think a lot of the things I do on campus, in the classroom, yes, I teach about the history of race, but outside of the classroom, I am there to support our students when they encounter the effects of these historical things in their daily lives.
I think immigration is a critical concern because when you see the person walking down the street, I don't want you to be afraid of them. I want you to already know something about them. So I introduce my students at Saint Xavier and Saint Xavier community to the Middle Eastern community. And my concern is to have our students, when they go out into the world and work and interact with others, is not be afraid of them, be curious in a positive way, know something, even something small about them, and try to interact with them and learn even more about them. So that's why I believe immigration is an amazingly important critical concern.
I mean, when you think about how much the environment is, for example, so dependent upon so many aspects of human activity, right? Because really when it comes down to the environment, it's so interconnected. And then people will then come around and say, well, I don't see it. It looks like it's snowing out there. I don't see any global warming right now. Well, you gotta understand that you have to look at so many different facets.
We got a laser cutter on campus and a 3D printer on campus at about the same time. The 3D printer basically takes plastic and produces more plastic. And unfortunately, we figured out pretty quickly that it basically creates these sort of garbage plastic things that nobody actually wants. And this is a problem. And do I want to be a part of a program that's going to create more garbage to float in the ocean? No. And in fact, we figured out pretty quickly that that wasn't the right tool for us.
I think for a very long time, it was very just straight sell, right? You want to get somebody to buy something, and they can continue to buy it. Now they have to worry about societal needs, because if you don't have a society, there's nothing to sell to. If the environment doesn't exist, obviously, if the earth doesn't exist, there's nobody to sell to. So I think companies have thought, oh crap, we need to think not just short term, not just about our consumers' needs, not just straight selling, but more broadly about the environment, even if that means that they have to do initiatives where they lose money. And from my instructing perspective, I tell my students, it's like, you're just not passive, you're active in this process. You now have a lot more say than we ever had in the past.
Most recently, that's become my creative endeavor. I've been making all sorts of artworks just out of the scraps. I'm trying to avoid using new raw material, virgin material, instead continuously make things out of more and more and more of the scrap. That's, I guess, the bigger point, that I'm not necessarily just doing this because it's a way to make art, but it's a way to make art to use this particular critical concern of the Sisters of Mercy, that of the earth or of the environment, to not just grounded in my own personal interests, but grounded in something that's a little more universal, trying to look at a universal sort of concern.
Why is it important to understand population biology? Why is it important to understand how organisms interact in the environment? Because once you see the connections of things, then you realize just how much you are actually caught up in that. And that is why it's so important, I think, when we have a curriculum here that professes the liberal arts, type of tradition. It's because you want students, again, to be able to approach aspects of, let's say, why the environment is important from so many venues, from a philosophical, from a religious, to an economic, to, of course, a scientific, from a health, from a psychological. Because really when it comes down to the environment, it's so interconnected.
When I came to Saint Xavier, I had not heard of the critical concerns, and I actually hadn't even heard of the Sisters of Mercy, so it wasn't something that informed my teaching right away. Now I've learned that a lot of the things I teach are critical concerns.
I think this was just part of the process of becoming, I think, a faculty here, was trying to make that connection, partly for my students, partly for myself, and just realizing that when you teach science, you have this responsibility to try to make these connections.
I think for a new faculty member to try to figure out what's the intersection of my research and the critical concerns, I would say that there's always something there to be connected. Whatever you do can definitely be tied to issues in gender inequality. Whatever you do can definitely be tied to racism.
Not only does it allow students to have at the forefront the 5 critical concerns, but it also allows students to identify from class to class, from instructor to instructor, these important concepts, ideals, and goals.
Collaboration is important. Doing projects together is important. Now we need to be more engaged with faculty from other disciplines. Interdisciplinary effort in research and service, it's so important.
We certainly have a lot of resources here in the university that can certainly help you. We have Sisters of Mercy who are involved and are very passionate in the critical concerns and are still very active in helping to fight for those critical concerns as well.
We have a vehicle. This institution as a whole is allowing us to say that part of its mission are these critical concerns. So we can take that and introduce those critical concerns in every topic, every class that we teach, and every discussion that we have. Not because they're the mission of the university, but because they're critical concerns for people around the world.
Looking at this set of critical concerns and finding a way that you can connect any one of those to any part of your academic experience, and suddenly it actually makes a lot of sense.
I'm a biblical scholar by training, and the Jews say that the Torah is a diamond. So just as a diamond has many faces, they say for every biblical passage, it has 70 facets, and you have to keep turning and turning and turning the diamond to look at it from another angle. As students encounter different professors, we can think about it as if they each have a facet. They each have a way of looking at things and showing us something that we can't see for ourselves. So the beautiful thing is that everyone's experience of the mission, of the critical concerns, will look a little different. It will be richer. It will be multifaceted. And students will be able to look at it from a variety of disciplines, and I think that's wonderful.